Ladies and gentlemen, I want to read something to you. In the age of rogue regimes pursuing nuclear weapons, there clearly are occasions when preemption is prudent. For a government to be irresolute in the face of a growing or imminent threat to its citizenry is suicidal. Believe it or not, that's from my book, Liberty and Tyranny. Now, let me quote somebody who may be a little bit more persuasive to you. John Kennedy, in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in a speech to the American people, when the Soviets, Khrushchev, were putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. He said in part, "My fellow citizens, let no one doubt that this is a difficult and dangerous effort on which we have set out. No one can see precisely what course it will take or what costs or casualties will be incurred. Many months of sacrifice and self-discipline lie ahead, months in which our patience and our will be tested, months in which many threats and denunciations will keep us aware of our dangers. But the greatest danger of all would be to do nothing." Now, how did we reach a point in our country where so much of the ruling class, the Democrat Party, the media, academia, who know exactly what we know, that is, that a monstrous terrorist regime, Iran, that has killed tens of thousands of its own people and has killed and maimed thousands of Americans directly and through its terror proxies over a 47-year period, rejects preemptively attacking such a genocidal regime before it perfects the development of nuclear warheads and intercontinental ballistic missiles with which to literally blow our country off the face of the earth. How did we reach this point? The Iranian regime's negotiators told our envoys 10 days ago, they said it, they have enough enriched uranium to make 11 nuclear bombs within 10 days. They were bragging about it. They had 22,000 pounds of nuclear material. That's not all. They'd also been disguising their research development program, meaning in 4 to 6 weeks, they had enough nuclear material to make about 25 bombs. Don't believe me? That's them telling our envoys. And they announced that they had no intention of giving up any of it or stopping or giving it to third parties. They were stiffing us. Despite the fact that President Trump had amassed an enormous military presence at their doorstep to pressure them during the negotiations, they didn't care. Let me ask you something. What would Franklin Roosevelt have done? What would Harry Truman have done? What would John Kennedy have done? 3 former Democrat presidents. They would have acted. But not Obama, not Biden, not Schumer, not Jeffries, and the second-rate leadership of the modern-day Democrat Party. Instead, they're trying to sabotage President Trump and our military with ridiculous votes demanding that our armed forces surrender in the middle of their extraordinary campaign, and with endless propaganda intended to dispirit and disunite our country, giving aid and comfort to the enemy and the enemy's allies. Pretty appalling, I would say. Now, we're hearing a lot, we even have charts, about the price of gasoline going up. Well, would you rather have nukes pointing at us or a 25-cent increase in a gallon of gasoline? Now, if you had Biden or a Democrat, you'd have nukes pointing at us, plus an 80-cent increase in a gallon of gasoline. I'll prove it to you. Here we have from June 2022, Americans for Prosperity. A gallon of gasoline rose, on average, to $4.86 a gallon. 80 cents higher than it was a few months earlier. Wow. And what else? Here, they made these multiple decisions that drove up the price of gasoline because of climate change, because of their ideology having nothing to do with military operation and nukes whatsoever. And everybody was cheering it. All the climate change nuts, the media thought it was great, the Democrats thought it was great. Well, what did they do? They did a lot in order to drive up the price of gasoline while they were subsidizing the Iranians and their nuclear program. They adopt new EPA oil and gas rules. The EPA announced new regulations governing methane emissions from oil and gas production, transmission, storage, distribution that would cost more than $1 billion a year. What else did they do? Biden signed a resolution that overturned the first Trump administration reforms to EPA oil and gas rules. This resolution worsened energy poverty, reestablished burdensome regulations, and had a disproportionate impact on small businesses. I don't remember the Democrats and the media complain. I don't remember all the charts. Now, this Biden regulation is going to drive up the cost of gasoline 25 cents. They restricted and impeded energy projects. Among their first actions taking office, they halted new oil and gas leases on federal lands and in waters. They had delayed decisions on these leases. They delayed some of them, a move that resulted in higher energy costs for the most vulnerable consumers. And they did this because of their ideology in climate change, not because they were trying to prevent nuclear missiles from hitting our country. Seems to me they had things a little out of whack. The administration canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. They suspended oil and gas leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and New Mexico. What else did they do? A lot. Without the consent of Congress, Biden... Oh, wait a minute. Without the consent of Congress? I thought you needed the consent of Congress every time you sneezed. No? Okay. Just wanted to make sure. Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement, which resulted in onerous new regulations that could further raise the price of gasoline. And when Trump got out of it, it was, oh, my God, he got out of the Paris deal? Oh, what are we going to do? Reduce prices. What else did they do? They failed to take adequate action on annual requirements and small refinery waivers for the renewable fuel. In other words, they were smothering production, smothering delivery, smothering new leases, just smothering it. And they drove the price of gasoline up, and not for the short term. If President Trump hadn't been elected, prices wouldn't come down. As I said, you would have had an 80-cent, $1.50 increase in gasoline, as we did under Biden, plus the nukes. Plus the nukes, yeah. All right. I'm trying to address a number of these issues that keep popping up. I want to deal with this declaration of war stuff again, because you're getting fed a whole ton of lies. Declared wars. Declared wars. The last declared war was 84 years ago. Since then, none. Historic wars that were declared. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War in 1846, the Spanish-American War in 1898, World War I, 1917 to 1918, our participation. World War II, 41 to 45, that's where most of the declarations came, against Japan, Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. What else? Nothing else. That's it. We've had 125 military actions, some of them very significant. Some of them very significant. And no other declarations of war. But we're told it's an impeachable offense. Well, you would have to impeach Jefferson. You'd have to, the whole line. You have to impeach Truman. You'd have to impeach Kennedy. You would have had to impeach LBJ, both Bushes. A lot of impeachment going on. Major undeclared conflicts. The Barbary Pirates, I should say, by Jefferson. He seemed to know something about the Constitution. The Korean War, 1950 to 53. Truman called it a police action. The Vietnam War, 1960s to 70s, initiated by Eisenhower and Kennedy, escalated by Johnson, went into the Nixon term, ended under Ford. Nobody declared war. The Persian Gulf War, 1990 to 91, initiated by George H.W. Bush, no declaration. Afghanistan and Iraq, initiated by George W. Bush and continued in the case of Afghanistan by Biden. No declaration of war. Almost all U.S. presidents, 43 of 45, have utilized military force without a declaration of war. So why do they keep lying? Because it's Trump, and they're undermining our military, and they're giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Every time they talk about this being an illegal war, or they have one of these phony votes for the radical left-wing kooks, and the lawyers who don't know what they're talking about, but think they know what they're talking about, they do great harm to our country. Great harm to our country. Now we have what's called the Department of Justice and the Office of Legal Counsel. I'm quite familiar with both because I worked there for a period of time. The Office of Legal Counsel is considered sort of the legal brain trust for the government. Scalia used to head it. Rehnquist headed it at one point and so forth. Really smart people. And what did they do about the power of the president when it comes to war? Does he have to get pre-approval from Congress? Wow, I read my Constitution. Nothing like that's in there. Oh, well, that's the way we're supposed to interpret it. No, it isn't. So the president doesn't need pre-approval. He doesn't even need to give them advance notice. Some have, some haven't. The War Powers Act of 1973. You hear people keep throwing this around. I ask you, Mr. and Mrs. America, can you amend the Constitution with a statute? No. It's unconstitutional. And yet they try to, define what the president can and cannot do. And then we get this line, they never meant for the president all by himself to have the power of a king. They meant what they meant. They didn't say he should have a power of a king. They gave the power of the purse to whom? To Congress. And they can use that to withhold funds or cut off funds. It's harder to cut off funds because the president would veto such a bill, but it's not so hard to withhold funds. Now, how do we know? In 1975, Congress decided they wanted to put an end to the Vietnam War against what Gerald Ford wanted to do. So what did Congress do? They cut funds to the South Vietnamese from about 1.4 billion to 1.4 trillion to about 700. Let me fix that. About 1.4 million to about 700,000 or something to that effect. They cut it in half. And what happened? Well, we couldn't keep supporting the South Vietnamese. And so Gerald Ford announced the war's over. So Congress can do something like that if it wishes. So it's not without power. It's just its power is limited. And of course they didn't want 535 knuckleheads in charge of war. Look at these people. Seriously? How are you going to have a debate anyway? The enemy's getting ready. You want to hit the enemy? Surprise, no surprise. It doesn't even make any sense. And that's what the framers said. First, they said Congress will make war, have the power to make war. That's what the Committee of Detail said. And then the rest of the body saw it at the Constitutional Convention. That's not going to work. No. And so they created what they created. But according to the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice, they've written over and over and over again that the president has significant power to make war. They did it in 2001, 2002, 2002 again. They did it in 1980. They did it in 1992, 1994. These are memos that are put out, official memos. 1995. They did it in 2000, 2011. They did it again, 2024. And in 1993, they've done it a dozen times. Maybe the media should try reading it. I think so. But what have the Democrats done? They just don't object to the war. They're sabotaging our country. You know, this Department of Homeland Security that was created some decades ago, to do what? To provide homeland security. And there are elements within that department that are very, very serious about protecting us. We have the TSA, we have FEMA, we have the U.S. Coast Guard, which is actually part of the military. So what have the Democrats done? Operation Sabotage. That's what they've done. Secret Service agents. Do you know Secret Service agents today are not getting paid? Do you know the TSA people are not getting paid? Do you know the FEMA people are not getting paid? Do you know the Coast Guard's not getting paid? We're talking about a couple 100,000 people. Now, what is the U.S. Coast Guard? It's a branch of the armed forces that operates under the Department of Homeland Security during peacetime. It focuses on maritime security, safety, law enforcement. As a military service, it defends coastal borders. It conducts protection against these drug cartels and so forth and so on. Tries to protect us from terrorists. Don't you think they ought to fund that? They're blaming the Republicans. The Democrats have defunded the Coast Guard. They have defunded TSA. They have defunded these protections that we have in place. The TSA, they're involved in more than checking you when you go on a plane. They screen over 2 million passengers daily at 440 federalized airports. They have intelligence and screening mechanisms, secure flight program to make sure that the passengers check the records that they have, surface transportation security, airplanes, trains, highways, ports, pipeline systems that terrorists can hit. Federal air marshals work for the TSA, and TSA collaborates with other agencies to secure international travel. Now, don't you think that's important at a time of war like this against a terrorist regime? Well, the Democrats have defunded all of these elements. They've defunded them. And ICE, they hate ICE. Oh, they hate ICE. Why? Because ICE is following the law and wants to deport illegal aliens. Future Democrat voters, according to the Democrats. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, boy, do they get a bum rap, and they are great heroes. They've reported stopping thousands of individuals identified as national security threats, including 1,400 known or suspected terrorists, they call them KSTs, removed from the United States in recent years. In fiscal year 2022 alone, ICE reported 55 arrests of known or suspected terrorists. And the Democrat Party says they want to defund it. They want to tie its hands. You know, they call it reform. They want to tie its hands so they can't do their job. Since 2006, ICE has reported arresting nearly 13,000 known or suspected terrorists. In the first 50 days of 2025, 39 known or suspected terrorists were arrested. So naturally, the Democrats are attacking ICE. You know, they're not attacking illegal aliens. They're not attacking the Islamist Nazis in Iran. They're giving them aid and comfort. They want to pull back our military. What the hell does that party stand for? What do they stand for? Thank God we have this president of the United States at this time, who understands that a nuclear-armed Islamist Nazi 7th century primitive regime that slaughters 50,000 of its own people in the blink of an eye will be happy to blow us off the face of the earth. Can you imagine? And then they have 10, 20,000 ballistic missiles. You know what the Democrat Party's answer to that is? They have none. They have none. All right, we've got a great show ready for you, and we'll be back in just a moment. I'll be right back.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.